Vader will be inducted into this year's WWE Hall of Fame class. WWE claimed that Bleacher Report was first to break the news, but Brad Shepard mentioned it first on Twitter a week earlier. Vader should have been a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame a long time ago, when he was still alive. So he becomes another in a growing list of names who now have to take their place posthumously, because Vince McMahon, for whatever reason, didn't want them in, or didn't think that the time was right. It's not as if they didn't have their chance. Vader was brought in to induct Stan Hansen into the Hall of Fame in 2016, and he did a great job with it. And later that same year, Vader said that he was told by two heart doctors that his heart was worn out, and he was told by those doctors he was given less than 2 years to live. That same day, Mick Foley, one of his greatest rivals, went on Facebook. He pleaded, he begged with WWE to put Vader in their Hall of Fame the following year. Less than 2 years later, Vader was dead. And in that time, he was very vocal about wanting to be in the Hall of Fame. Maybe a little too vocal. As Sean Waltman said at the time, sometimes when you push too hard and you're out there begging for it too much, it works against you. And that sucks in that case. That's what Sean Waltman said. It does suck. It sucks that he won't be able to give his own speech. I'm sure he would have some interesting stories to tell. Although it may not have mattered anyway if these news reports I'm seeing are true. The WWE is having most of this year's inductions done digitally, possibly without any speeches, to allow more time for The Undertaker's induction. These days, it might not be so shocking if you're watching wrestling, if you're watching WWE or AEW, and you see a 400-pound man hit a moonsault off the top rope. It might not seem all that shocking these days, because there's a lot of big men doing moves that are usually reserved for the smaller guys. And if I was one of the smaller guys, I would be pissed. But, everybody does dives today. I mean, hell, I saw Keith Lee hit a Spanish fly off the top rope. I think it might have been in the match he had last year with Drew McIntyre. It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But 30 years ago, to see Vader climb up to the top rope and hit a moonsault was incredible. And by the time he started doing it, he was already a world champion. It's not as if he started doing it when he was really young just to get himself noticed. He did it because he could. It was a challenge to him. You did not want to find yourself on the receiving end of those clubbing shots from Vader in the corner. Vader was a scary man, especially if you were a younger wrestling fan and he had that look. Back in the Big Van Vader days, and he would come out, he looked all intimidating and stuff. You did not want to be standing across the ring from Vader. The greatest super heavyweight of all time. I get asked questions occasionally, who's the greatest big man, who's the greatest this, who's the greatest that, and I've said, and you can classify super heavyweight any which way you want. I kind of look at it as maybe somebody who's, in that 350 and up pound range, but the greatest super heavyweight of all time, bar none, in professional wrestling, was Vader. When I think of Vader, I don't just think of the top rope moonsault, I think of the mask. I think of that helmet that he used to wear to the ring and how badass it looked. When I think of Vader, I think of his debut in New Japan Pro Wrestling. And I was, too young at the time. I wasn't tape trading. I didn't know at the time that, this guy Vader had debuted in New Japan. It was a gimmick, by the way, that almost went to Jim Hellwig. Almost went to the Ultimate Warrior and Sid Vicious before ultimately they brought Leon White in to play the part. How different things would have been if Jim Hellwig had taken the helmet and taken the gimmick for himself. I'll go out on a limb here and say that I don't think it would have worked out as well as it did for Vader. But the night before he debuted, I was attending my very first live wrestling event at Madison Square Garden. I got to watch the Macho Man Randy Savage in the main event. The next night, halfway around the world, Vader arrived on the scene and he destroyed Antonio Inoki, which caused a riot that was so bad it led to New Japan being banned from Sumo Hall. When I think of Vader and what a tough son of a bitch the guy was, I think of his famous match, or infamous, depending on how you look at it, with Stan Hansen, where Hansen nailed Vader in the face so hard, he popped the man's eye out He popped the man's eye out of its socket. Vader had to push his own eye back in so he could finish the match. I'll never forget when I'm watching this match online one day, and I'm watching this, and I'm going, what is going on here? And he pulls his mask off because obviously his eye was like, you know, practically hanging out. He had to push it back in, and he finished the match. When I think of Vader, I think of all of the classic matches that he was part of. Some really great matches that I would recommend you all go and seek out and watch immediately if you have never seen them before. Quite a few of them came during his run in WCW in 1992 and 1993. He gave Sting the best matches of his career. Bar none. The best series of matches that Sting ever had in his entire career. It was not the matches with Ric Flair. It was not any matches he had with Hulk Hogan or anybody else in any other promotion. It was the matches that he had in the early 90s in WCW against Vader. Their match in the King of Cable tournament final at Starrcade 92. Their White Castle of Fear strap match at Super Brawl 3. Those are the two that stand out to me. I know they had other matches as well. The night that he dropped the WCW title to Ron Simmons, which is a moment people still talk about to this day, in fact. You know, Simmons winning the World Championship. Simmons and Steve Austin just spent 15 minutes talking about it on the Broken Skull sessions. His rivalry with Mick Foley. If Sting was his greatest adversary in WCW, then Cactus Jack was right behind him in number 2. The matches they had on TV were shockingly brutal for that time. They would be shockingly brutal today, let alone 30 years ago on TBS. Their Texas Death Match at Halloween Havoc 93, that's another good one to watch. Of course, the match that gets talked about the most is their house show match in Germany in 94, where Foley lost most of his ear. It's the stuff of wrestling lore. You know, if you were an older wrestling fan who grew up many, many, many years ago, you probably think of Yukon Eric. A lot of fans today, myself included, when we hear about the ear being ripped off, I don't think of Yukon Eric and, you know, going back that far. I think of Mick Foley in WCW. The match that Vader had with Ric Flair in the main event of Starrcade in 93 is an all-time classic. It was going to be Sid and Vader, and Sid was going to win the championship. And then the stuff happened overseas, the scissors incident with Sid and Arn Anderson, and Sid got fired. Instead, Ric Flair subbed for him, and I think they were in Charlotte. I think they were in the Carolina. Like, it was perfect. It was the perfect story to tell, was Flair, and it was his first title win since coming back, since leaving WWF. And he goes out there, and I remember the build. I think it was Tony Schiavone, I think, who was like with him maybe in the limo on his way to the building, if I'm remembering. I think it was Tony. But like the story they told was just so great, and the match they had was fantastic. It's an all-time classic. When I think of Vader, I think of a man who underachieved in his WWE run. By that point, he wasn't the same performer that he was during that peak WCW run. He had injuries. He had gotten heavier. But he was still damn good, and he was very believable as a monster heel. You know, the guy was a champion and a top guy everywhere he went, except WWE. Now, he was one of the top guys. I don't want to say he wasn't a top guy in WWE, because that wouldn't really be accurate. He had plenty of main events, and he was considered to be, you know, kind of in that top mix. But he was never really one of the top guys in that company like he was every single other place that he ever worked. He should have had a run with the World Championship. And at one point it was planned, but, you know, Shawn Michaels had other ideas. I think of that great angle they shot the night he debuted on Monday Night Raw after the Royal Rumble. He came into the company with a shoulder injury that he needed surgery for. So he debuted in the Rumble. He didn't win it, but he got to look dominant. But then the next night on TV, he made his singles debut. And when his match was over, he squashes Gorilla Monsoon in the corner. Gorilla Monsoon, who had been retired for years. He was the president of the WWF at the time in storyline. And nobody put their hands on Gorilla Monsoon. And so Jim Cornette was put with Vader. And I remember that moment where, you know, Monsoon's in one corner of the ring, and I think he's with the referee, Jack Doan, I think it was, checking on him, and Vader is in the opposite corner, and he's seething, and Cornette was great. Cornette's putting his hands up like, no, don't do it, don't do it. And Vader just shoves Cornette down to the ground, squashes Monsoon, big splash, big avalanche in the corner, and then gives him a Vader bomb. But that gave them a reason to get him off TV, so, because he got suspended, so he can go off and have shoulder surgery. And then they needed him back for some six-man tag at WrestleMania. He wasn't fully healed. Again, I think that injury really hampered the beginning of his run and maybe the way he was perceived in his matches, because, they weren't great at the beginning there, but he wasn't 100% either. But that match he had with Shawn Michaels at SummerSlam in 96 was very good. As was the Final Four match in 97 for the WWF title, where he cut his eye. He was bleeding like crazy. I'll never forget that close-up shot of his bloody face they used on the cover of Raw magazine in 97. There were even supposedly plans to put the Intercontinental title on him later in 97 until the incident in Kuwait. They were overseas in the Middle East, and he's on this morning show with The Undertaker. They're in Kuwait. And he roughed up the television host who asked him if wrestling was fake. And I've told that story before, I think in the This Week in History segments I used to do. There's more to it than that. Vader always claimed that one of the producers of the show put him up to it. It was like they were playing a rib on the host, but the host wasn't in on the rib. And so when he put his hands on him, he didn't beat him up or anything, but he scared this guy shitless. And so that's when Vader ended up under house arrest in Kuwait. He was stuck there for like 2 weeks. Anyway, that was right around the time, supposedly, they were thinking about putting the IC title on him, and so it never happened. And really, it never happened at any point. He never held any gold of any kind during his time in WWE. When I think of Vader, I think of his last big match in Rev Pro against Will Ospreay, which was a spectacle just because of how much of a mismatch it was. On one hand, you have Ospreay. At the time, he would have been, God, this is probably 5 or 6 years ago now, but he was probably early 20s, one of the greatest high flyers in the world at that time, stepping into the ring against a 60-year-old super heavyweight. Talk about a styles clash. And there was a lot of controversy around that match and the finish, and, Vader won. Supposedly he didn't want to lose. Even up until the very end, people were still talking about Vader. For better or worse, they were still talking about Vader. But Vader is a deserving inductee into the Hall of Fame. I only wish it would have come sooner, and it is a disgrace that it did not happen once it became known that he didn't have much time left on this earth. People sometimes ask me about fantasy matches that we never got to see. And I mentioned some of the obvious ones, Bret Hart against Kurt Angle, The Undertaker against Sting, Hogan against Austin, Rock against Shawn Michaels. I'll throw one out here for you. Vader against Brock Lesnar. Big Van Vader against the Beast, Brock Lesnar. Imagine those two in their prime years. Lesnar, the freak athlete that he is, doing shooting star presses against 400-pound Vader doing moonsaults. Vader laying in those head and body shots, then Lesnar picks him up and starts suplexing him around. Those two would have beaten the absolute piss out of each other, and it would have been glorious. Shepard also claimed weeks ago on Twitter that the Steiner brothers are going to be inducted into this year's Hall of Fame class. So we'll see if that one pans out too. Meltzer in The Observer this week, there probably is smoke to the fire, because I saw Meltzer in The Observer also said there's been talk of them going in. That would be a little awkward. Not that they wouldn't be deserving of it either. Of course they would be. But that would be awkward after the comments that Scott has made in the past, calling their Hall of Fame a joke. Actually, that's the PG version of what he called it. He called it a fucking joke. He once said, "It doesn't exist. Would you go to a grocery store, but there is no food?" I think philosophical Scott Steiner is, he makes a good point. And I found the audio from the podcast I did with Steiner's quote. This was from 5 years ago. It was on a Slammiversary conference call. He was asked about a whole bunch of different things, and somebody asked him about the WWE Hall of Fame, and he went off. And I remember reading the quote on the podcast, and I lost my shit. I wish I had the actual audio of him saying it, but I'm going to splice it in here. This is the clip of me talking about what he said from Sound Off episode 502. And he talked about the WWE Hall of Fame. I wanted to pull the stuff he said about the Hall of Fame. Here's what he had to say about that and why we will not be seeing him in the Hall of Fame anytime soon. This is what he said about the Hall of Fame. He says, I'm not going into the WWE Hall of Fame. I'm not going somewhere where there's nowhere to go. Where's it at? I'm not going somewhere where if I get into some trouble, I can't call 911. I can't have a beacon call to the Coast Guard. Because who knows? It could be in Atlantis for all I know. He's just going on and on. He's like, so basically, again, the Hall of Fame doesn't exist. It's all a figment of Vince McMahon's imagination. There is no physical Hall of Fame. And he's worried that, if he goes to the WWE Hall of Fame, which doesn't exist, that he may get trapped in some vortex, I guess, like the Bermuda Triangle or something. And he may not be able to call for help to get himself out of there, which is a valid concern to have. It is a valid concern for the man to have. But it gets better. It gets even better. So this is what he continued to say. He says, it could be underwater. It could be in parts unknown. I'm not going there. It's a joke. It's non-existent. It would be better to put the WWE Hall of Fame on the moon. At least then you can look up at the moon at night and say, wow, look at the WWE. Oh my God. Oh, I'm sorry. I have tears in my eyes right now. I have tears, literal tears in my eyes. He says, at least then you can say, wow, look at the WWE Hall of Fame. Oh my God. That will never not be funny to me. That will always bring a smile to my face. But his nephew works there now, so I guess you gotta play nice. Either that or he's getting soft in his old age. Andrew Zarian of the Mat Men podcast is also hearing that Psycho Sid is going into the Hall of Fame this year. If he does, I'll have more to say about his career when they announce it. Sid would be another deserving name who was a star everywhere he went, much like Vader. If Sid goes into the Hall of Fame, interesting little trivia note here. If Sid goes in, he and Undertaker would be the last of the men to hold the old Winged Eagle belt to be inducted. So if he goes in, every single person to have held that first, I'm not talking about the Big Eagle from the Attitude Era, but that Winged Eagle belt that lasted from 88 to 98, every single person to have held that championship at that point then would be in the WWE Hall of Fame.